All right, let me finish out this chapter. But again, let me reiterate that page 31 is the most important part of the chapter, the chart on the top of the page. And as I said, in addition to looking at the different ratios of advantage on the left side of the chart, the United States having this enormous advantage in the production of computers, 10 to 1, as opposed to having only a slight advantage in the production of shoes. To the right side is the computation of the opportunity cost. It's just a basic function of dividing the numbers by one another. Now, the difference between the classical theory of trade and the neoclassical theory of trade, which is discussed on page 38, is really relatively simple. In the classical theory, it is rational for a country to devote all of its labor or all of its capital to the production of that good in which it has the greatest comparative advantage. In the case of the United States and Brazil, the United States should devote all of its resources to computers and really give up the production of any shoes. And Brazil should do just the opposite, give up the production of any computers and concentrate solely on shoes, consuming some at home, exporting the rest abroad. But the neoclassical theory, which followed De Ricardo, and the evolution of that theory is described in the book, realized that that probably was not the case. That at a certain point, as you devote more and more labor to the production of shoes or computers, that the opportunity cost of producing computers as opposed to shoes, or shoes as opposed to computers, is going to rise. The reason for that is simple, and I'll focus on labor. Remember, the production of any product is a function of labor and capital. Capital meaning machines, labor being workers. And that is, as you draw in more and more workers into the production of computers, you're really drawing in workers who are less and less capable, less and less trained. You may have to devote more time and energy to training them to do the work. They may be the less competent workers, and so they aren't as efficient in their work. And so the opportunity cost goes up. In terms of the graph, the curve begins to curve even more. Now you're giving up more shoes to produce fewer computers. And so the neoclassical theory says, well, at a certain point, a country like the United States may still produce some shoes. It's still going to concentrate on computers, but because the labor force in the textile industry is less well educated, whatever, they can't read, and producing computers, which is not easy, is beyond their capacity. It's too expensive to retrain them, they're older, whatever. And so we'll continue to leave that labor in the production of shoes. And Brazil will do the same. It won't give up completely the production of computers. And of course, there could be other reasons they may not want to do so, just to have a hand in that industry. They'll continue to produce some computers. So the countries don't completely give up the production of the other product. But the majority, the vast majority of their labor, of their capital, will go into the production of the good. Computers in the case of the United States, shoes in the case of Brazil, that they have the comparative advantage in. Now let's look at, first of all, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem and protectionism and Stolper-Samuelson. Now again, these are not the most important parts of the book, but they elaborate on this logic of trade. Heckscher-Ohlin simply says that countries are going to emphasize the production of products using a factor. A factor of production is labor capital, in which they have an advantage. Countries like China, India, up until recently had an enormous advantage in terms of labor. Plentiful labor, paid very little, and in both countries relatively well trained. Now, Chinese labor for years may not have been very well paid, but they were fairly well trained. Mainly because the educational system in China is pretty good. Same in India. So countries like China and India, at least up to a point, are going to stress the production of products in which they have an advantage and affluence of that factor of production, namely labor. Capital, machinery, new technology is more rare, more expensive. I went to a Chrysler Cherokee plant outside Beijing some years ago, and here was all this modern equipment sitting there that they had paid an enormous amount of money to import, and it was doing nothing because the workers they had did not know how to run it. And Chrysler at the time, which was running the plant, said it would take at least 2 to 3 years to get that plant up to normal production of what they could do in the United States because of the inadequacy of the labor. And the capital, the machinery, was extremely expensive. That's no longer the case, by the way. China imports high technology and uses it rather easily. For example, GM plants in China are just as modern as they are outside Detroit, but that is a recent development. In the United States' case, and again this is historically true, but particularly true for the last 15 or 20 years, we are rich in capital, in machinery. Go to any plant, car plant, pharmaceutical plant, computer chip plant, and it's overwhelmingly machinery. I worked in an automobile plant when I was a kid. I'm still shaking from it. And the machinery was really relatively backward. I put on wheels, and after working all day, it would take me about 3 hours to stop shaking. Go into an automobile plant today, and it's almost all robots, laser machinery, and other very sophisticated machinery. There are still workers. There's still things that have to be done by human labor, but much fewer. The plant I worked in had 2,500 workers. And the cars that produced were fewer, and I can tell you, particularly on Monday and Friday. Monday because men were recovering from drinking. Friday because they had started to drink. Were awful. But go into those plants today, and 300 or 400 workers. As machinery, particularly for the vital construction of the automobile frame, etc., does all the work. So the United States is rich in technology. And because technology not only produces a better product, but for the moment, we're not looking at quality, but produces it more efficiently than it would in another country, a less developed country. We concentrate on capital, and we favor trade because we can sell very well produced cars, computers, whatever, airplanes. Remember, in the world there are only 2 companies that produce civilian aircraft. Boeing out of Seattle and Airbus in Europe. Production of civilian aircraft is incredibly difficult. It's just not something you do the day after tomorrow. It takes years to develop. China's been working on civilian aircraft production for 15 years and they still can't produce it. Even automobiles. Very sophisticated production. So all that theorem tells you, Heckscher-Ohlin, is that countries will focus on that factor of production and the products that are produced thereof. In the case of labor, low value added shoes, textiles, whatever, manual assembly of Apple computers, whatever. While the more developed countries, the United States, Germany, Japan, will focus on products that are produced primarily by machinery. Now, there is a logic of protectionism, that trade does often prove detrimental to an economy, and countries, for whatever reason, may want to protect their industries. Let me focus for the moment on what is called the infant industry argument. Like a child who needs to be protected in its early years, industries, when they just start out, let's say computers in Brazil, can in no way compete with computers from the United States. Bring in computers with a low tariff from the United States and they're going to obliterate the Brazilian computer industry. And so the infant industry argument is that for some time, of course, how long is a big question, industries like computers in Brazil need to be protected. And the way to protect them is to have tariffs on the import of computers from more sophisticated countries like the United States, Japan, whatever. And that basically is allowed under GATT and WTO rules. That countries are given a chance to protect these industries for a period of time. Of course, the question is how long. And it's always tough to give this up. Korea protected its automobile industry even to the point when they were exporting automobiles to the rest of the world, and we had to pressure them, and Japan had to pressure them to eliminate their tariffs on the import of automobiles from Japan and elsewhere. So there is a logic to protectionism, but only short term. Trade theory basically argues that protectionism, particularly over the long term, is very detrimental to overall economic welfare. You're protecting inefficiency and the irrational allocation of resources. Now let's look at the Stoper-Samuelson theory. What it says very simply is that within countries, Heckscher-Ohlin is between countries, within countries, there may be certain parts of your economy that will resist trade. In the case of the United States, industries like textiles in states like North Carolina that still rely heavily on labor, a more higher price than in a country like China, and they will seek protectionism. Indeed, for years in Congress, it always drove me nuts when the textile lobbyists would show up in the House of Representatives and argue for higher tariffs to protect their industries in North Carolina, which employed very few people, were low-paying jobs, against outside competition. So within a country there will be some groups, and because the United States is disadvantaged in labor, our labor is relatively fewer in number and hence more expensive, that makes it very difficult for American textile companies, for example, to compete with their Chinese counterparts, etc. While on the other hand, industries like cars, computers, aircraft will be in favor of trade. Boeing, for example, would virtually almost disappear if it could not sell aircraft abroad. Boeing sells the vast majority of its airplanes outside this country to non-American airlines. And so within a country there will be differences on the trade issue. Historically, again because the United States is rich in capital, and because we had a tradition really from the beginning of being advocates of free trade. Keep in mind, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, was produced just when we were becoming a country. Our founding fathers were basically advocates of free trade. We opposed the British because they restrained trade. And as a capital-rich country, we favored trade because you're going to produce more aircraft, more computers, more cars than will be consumed here. As I said, Boeing, I believe, now exports something like 70% of all the aircraft they produce. And that's very high value-added production. Those are good-paying jobs, folks. That's not minimum wage labor out there in Seattle. Same thing with Microsoft. All right, I'll upload these computers. Have a nice spring break. You can view the videos. Have any questions, email me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still in recovery mode, as you can probably tell. And I will send you the problem set number 4 tomorrow.